Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by three very important and very distinguished sponsors. First up we have AASA. AASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Regular listeners of Knowing Animals will know AASA very well. They have supported Knowing Animals for quite a few years now. AASA is the membership body for academics, artists and advocates interested in animal issues. Now AASA does very good work to support animal studies scholars. You can follow AASA at their Facebook page. You can also join AASA by going to their website, the Australasian Animal Studies Association AASA website. Supporting AASA is a way to support animal studies, so please think about joining AASA, the organisation that supports animal studies scholars and artists. Our second sponsor is a new sponsor. Our second sponsor is actually a book. The book is called After Coetzee, an Anthology of Animal Fictions. Now, After Coetzee is published by Faunery Press. That's F-A-U-N-A-Y Press. Now, people who have been following animal issues for many years will know that Coetzee has had a very big impact on animal studies. Coetzee is a very, very well-regarded writer. He is a winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he often addresses very tricky and important animal issues. So this book is a very good way about thinking about the impact that Coetzee has had on animal fictions. So I highly recommend the book to you. You can find out more about where to find the book in the notes for this podcast. And my recommendation is that you go and buy a copy, one for yourself, but also order one for your university library. So that's the book After Coetzee, an Anthology of Animal Fictions. Grab one for your university or local library. Right, our final sponsor is Kibbl. That is Kibbl. Now, Kibbl is a new app that has been developed to data mine information from the web about adoptable pets from pounds and animal sanctuaries. And it's also an app that you can use to raise money for animal charities. So I have been following Kibbl on Facebook, and I have to warn you, they have some very, very adorable animals that are currently at pounds or animal shelters looking for their forever home. But Kibbl isn't just something that can be followed on Facebook. They're also an app. So go to your local app store, Google Play or such, and download Kibbl. It's a free app, and by using it, you'll be helping animals find their forever home. You can learn more about Kibbl by going to their website, which is kibbl.io, and you can learn more information about the organisation and the work they do by, again, having a look at the podcast notes. So there are our three sponsors for this episode, and I thank them very much for their support. Right. Well, it's quite early in the morning here in Switzerland. This is the final recording for the European series. It's also the final day of our Representing the Unrepresented conference, which is taking place at the University of Freiburg. And today I'm very lucky to be joined by a PhD student who is from the United States of America, but currently studying in Canada. Dan, this is the part of the podcast where I work out that I've not practiced your name properly. So Dan Hooley, well done, I'm getting a nod, is a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Toronto. And Dan is here as part of the Representing the Unrepresented conference that I've been attending. And today we're going to discuss his book chapter, A Moral Argument for Veganism, which he co-authored with Nathan Nobis, and it appeared in the edited collection Philosophy Comes to Dinner, Arguments About the Ethics of Eating, which was published by Routledge in 2016. So welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Dan, can you start by telling us why you wrote this piece?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I co-authored this piece with my friend and colleague Nathan, and the piece is part of the larger volume, Philosophy Comes to Dinner, that's trying to bring ethical and philosophical analysis to eating and ethical issues surrounding eating. So our motivation was to try to write a very accessible and kind of standalone piece that would make a straightforward case for veganism, which we both accept. And so part of the motivation there is that some of the arguments that are advanced are pretty theory-laden. So they might presume a rights-based approach to morality or to animals. They might presume a utilitarian framework. They might make claims about speciesism or equality. And I don't think anything is wrong. I think sometimes, especially a rights-based framework, which I accept, is really helpful. But I also think that you can make pretty convincing arguments that don't necessarily draw on those concepts or those frameworks. So part of our motivation was to make an argument that would hopefully be persuasive and reach a wider audience of readers and undergrads and university that wasn't presupposing any of those frameworks. So that was the kind of larger motivation. And what we appeal to is we think one way you can begin to evaluate how we should eat and these practices is to just look at the harms involved and to ask, well, what are the sorts of reasons people give to justify these harms? Let's examine those reasons. And we think it's a pretty convincing case can be made that when you do that, those reasons aren't convincing. And so hopefully that makes a good initial case that people should adopt a vegan diet. Yeah.
So you start with the positive argument, and then, as you say, you then respond to possible reservations or counter-arguments. So let's begin with the positive argument. Your focus is on harm to animals. Why is harm significant?
Yeah, so I think harm is a particularly helpful concept in this discussion. When people maybe think initially about the ways animals can be hurt or animals can be made to suffer, a lot of times we're drawn to the most visible forms of suffering, and those I'm sure a lot of your listeners are aware of that. We don't have to go into them, but those are readily present in animal agriculture. But if we just focused on suffering, if we just focused on psychological forms of suffering, on pain, on even maybe more mentally complex things like boredom and the way sows, female pigs might just be incredibly bored in gestation crates, we would also miss, I think, other types of ways in which we are harming other animals. So one way we might think about that is, in addition to these very serious forms of suffering, we're also depriving these animals of the sorts of goods that would make their lives go well. So, I mean, a way to think about this in the context of animals is if a pig was kept in a small cage, and the pig could move around, but it was deprived of access to the outdoors, of social interactions and relationships with other pigs, the ability to make some choices and move around and have interesting stimulation throughout the day. That, I think, is a harm to the pig. It makes the pig's life worse off. And we think we have similar ideas, in the human case. We can imagine a child who lives in a place where she could be educated and is deprived of an education. We think of that as a harm. So part of our motivation for focusing on harm is we think it's a broad concept that captures a lot of the different ways we make animals worse off. And it's also one that I think most people are committed to, that if harms are involved, if harms to individuals are involved, then they require a serious moral justification. And without that sort of justification, any sort of practices that involve serious harms are morally wrong. And so that's the sort of case we make. And the first part of the essay is reviewing some of the different types of harm and trying to explore some of the other ways, maybe less visible ways, that animals are harmed. So I mentioned the ways animals are harmed by being deprived of certain goods. We also argue it's a bit more controversial, but I think most people are committed to this for a lot of animals, that being killed is a harm, that death is another serious type of deprivation. And this applies to the sort of cases people imagine where animals might be treated better on smaller farms. Even there, they're living for a short duration and they're being deprived of a much longer life filled with good experiences. And so that deprivation, we think, is a very serious harm. So what's interesting about our argument is it makes no claim that other animals are equals, or they deserve equal consideration, or that people should reject speciesist. You could deny those things and still accept our argument. And so that's part of the motivation for focusing on harm. We think it's quite plausible, way to approach it for people who aren't maybe familiar. But even apart from what ethical theory you have, we think it's something that should be widely shared. Yeah.
But you also do something that I've not seen done much, or perhaps at all, which is you talk about the harm to the people who work in animal agriculture. Mm-hmm. Why did you go in that direction? Yeah.
So I guess it might be somewhat controversial whether or not people who work in slaughterhouses, but also in factory farms, are harmed by that work. So maybe some of the less controversial ways are just the very dangerous nature of a lot of that work, and other ways they're people who work in this. So in the context of the United States and North America, where I'm more familiar, it tends to be a lot of immigrants and people who sometimes are undocumented immigrants who are in a more precarious work situation. But part of the harm we think, or we want to put forward as an idea, is that being subject to killing, particularly in slaughterhouses, killing animals at such a rapid pace makes the prospect of having we think, decent moral view towards them nearly impossible. So there's people who are looking for work who are in a precarious situation, and anyone who's buying meat from industrial animal agriculture requires that people are put in this situation where it's nearly impossible for them to have what we think are decent moral views towards other animals. You're almost forced to kind of objectify them to just get through the work. Now someone might say, well, they choose to do this work, they're committing moral wrongs. I think that kind of ignores the role consumers play in creating this, but also just I think we should think more broadly. Is it a good thing to have? Is it acceptable when we put people in work situations, or products people buy put them in work situations where it really seems to compromise proper or just more decent relationships with other animals? So that's one type of potential harm, maybe more controversial. There are others and some interesting research that in addition to, say, the health problems caused to those in the community, that there might be higher rates of certain types of crime. And that might go back to just the kind of brutal, emotionally taxing nature of this sort of work. So that's a sort of argument that I think could appeal to people who maybe are even less concerned with animals, and to say, look, you're putting humans in really terrible situations. Industrial animal agriculture requires that to make meat consumption and animal consumption cheap. That seems problematic to us.
So why don't we now turn to some of the objections?
Yeah, sure.
So what if I said to you, look, I think meat tastes really nice?
Yeah, so that's a common response. I get that a lot from students when I teach this. One of the ways we try to handle this or approach this objection is to say, most of us are already committed to this sort of response being utterly implausible in other cases outside of food. So if someone was trying to defend cockfighting or the fighting of chickens, and they said, look, I just really enjoy this, I think a lot of us would say, okay, but that doesn't count at all. That matters. That doesn't matter. It's trivial compared to the harms and suffering of these other animals. So one way we want to challenge that is to say we might be somewhat we might be rationalizing a lot when it comes to food, and it's interesting to maybe explore why. That's not something we do in the paper, but if we reject these sorts of appeals to the pleasure or happiness a product or an experience can give us in other areas, in fighting with animals, or in bullfighting or dog fighting, if we think it's just not plausible, then we should be committed to the same thing in other cases. And so I think it's an interesting question to explore why food can make people much more defensive. I think part of it is it's central to a lot of our enjoyable experiences and to a lot of traditions and a lot of cultural traditions. And so the prospect of people considering just eliminating something that seems to them so central can be concerning. And but I think we think it can be helpful to kind of step back and say, well, look, let's substitute something else for food and see what our reaction is. Most of us, we think, are pretty committed to the pleasure you get from a harmful practice not being at all sufficient to justify it, but maybe even not counting at all in the sort of moral calculation of that practice. So that's one way we try to get people to think about that response and to kind of look at the underlying moral considerations. Yeah.
So what if I said to you, look, I've got a chook living in my backyard and she lays eggs from time to time. Is it morally okay for me to eat those eggs? What would you say?
Yeah, so our paper is titled A Moral Argument for Veganism, but there probably should be a couple asterisks. So I think the issue of chickens laying eggs in particular, in some very rare and circumscribed situations, might be morally okay. So those would be situations where I think for the most part there's no commercial or industrial places that are going to provide chickens with good lives. You still have the issue if you're trying to do it at a commercial level where you have male chicks and they're going to kill them, they're not going to raise them. Chickens stop producing eggs at a certain time. So if you're trying to imagine a world where you're doing it commercially to make money, it's very implausible. Now, there are some possible exceptions. So you might imagine a chicken sanctuary that has chickens, they lay eggs. If it's the case that taking those eggs doesn't appear to be distressful or any sort of harm to the chicken, and people want to consume them, I'm not convinced that that's morally wrong. But it's important to note those are incredibly rare circumstances. It's probably a handful of places that might meet that. And when people are thinking of the sort of backyard chicken that you mentioned, there's a lot of, I think, important moral considerations that are sometimes lost. Choosing to have and keep a chicken is a very serious undertaking. You wouldn't want to contribute to these industries in the purchasing of the chicken. So I think that would kind of exclude anything but, say, the adoption of chickens. And it's a serious undertaking because you should be concerned about the long-term welfare and rights of the chicken. So the chicken might stop laying eggs at a certain point. You need to be concerned about the health of that chicken and the veterinary care and providing the conditions that would make a life go well for that chicken. And I think sometimes people who are into backyard chickens or who go that route aren't necessarily thinking through all those. And I think those are really important moral considerations. So it's veganism with an asterisk, and the small asterisk is there might be some exceptions where consuming chicken eggs in non-commercial settings is, on our view, morally okay. And that's because it's not contributing to harming these animals. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, Dan, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Let's go, yeah.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I can. So I attended a talk my first year of university that was on the topic of veganism and animal issues, and I went home that summer and I was like, I should read more about this. So I ordered both Animal Liberation, but I don't think that was the first one I read. I read a small volume by Tom Regan called Empty Cages, and I think that book is a really fantastic book that lays out in a very straightforward and I think easy to follow way the case for the moral rights of other animals. So that I believe was the first piece of kind of animal scholarship that I read. Yeah.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, I'm a bit young in my academic career, so this piece that you mentioned is the first published essay. I did write before this a book review of a really interesting book by Mark Rowlands called "Can Animals Be Moral?" And in it, Mark makes the argument that this sort of dichotomy, the popular dichotomy in philosophy and in animal studies between moral agents who can act morally and can be morally responsible and moral patients isn't capturing all of the ways individuals can relate to morality. And so part of the motivation for him, and he talks about this in his book, is when he had a child and he had 2 very large dogs, and he was just so impressed by their behavior towards his young infant, the sort of care they would take towards him. And if you think about it, like in this popular dichotomy, people might say, well, look, these dogs can't be held morally responsible. They're not moral agents. They can't act morally. And Rowland's book tries to challenge that idea. He wants to argue that, well, no, maybe there's another way of thinking of acting morally that doesn't necessarily require an individual to be morally responsible in all context, but we can still recognize other animals as acting from moral emotions and moral concerns. And so I think he presents a really interesting challenge to that idea, and it's also coming alongside of some work by ecologists and others that are saying, if we look at kind of evolutionary considerations and if we look at the behavior of other animals, there seems to be other types of moral emotions that evolved. And that shouldn't be surprising. Humans are animals that evolved with these. There are evolutionary reasons to think these sorts of moral concern could evolve. So that's the first piece I wrote, is a pretty positive review of that book by Mark Rowlands.
So, Dan, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
So I'm going to name 2 just because they're co-authors, Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka. Their book, Zoopolis, and some of their subsequent work really influenced the sort of work I'm doing now and the direction of my thesis, of my dissertation. It was interesting when I first read it because I'd been thinking about animal issues for a while, but the thought of thinking about them in an explicitly political context, considering other animals, domesticated animals, as our fellow citizens, was something someone who was steeped in this, had never thought of, or never really seriously thought of. And so it shook me in a way to just be aware of and realize the extent to which we harbor so many assumptions about other animals that increasingly we're beginning to re-examine. And so their work thinking on the political status of other animals and how we see them existing in and relating to our political institutions has had a large influence on my own work, but also just recognizing the extent to which we take for granted a lot of assumptions about animals that we should always be open to kind of rethinking. Yeah.
So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question. I think academics, it's important that they occupy a variety of roles. So some of the stuff I'm working on now that's different from this essay is concerned with thinking through what our long-term goals with respect to animals should be in relation to our political institutions. And so this is a type of work that to some people might appear pretty utopian. You know, if farmed animals are suffering on a truly immense scale, one legitimate question is to say, why be concerned with this? And I think part of it is that I think that progress for animals requires paying attention to different areas. So one area is trying to, and this is one role I think academics can play, is trying to think through clearly and with reason what sorts of long-term directions should we be headed. What are our long-term goals? And so that sort of maybe more academic work I think is important in terms of building a solid case and a solid vision. And then I think beyond that, I think academics should care about animals and be a part of the animal advocacy movement. And there, some of our skills, just in terms of thinking through reasons and arguments when they're relevant, or thinking through policy strategy, might be helpful. We don't have any, I think, unique abilities when it comes to that, but I think we should see that is something we should be a part of and something we're working on. So I think there's different roles that academics can and should play, and we should be kind of aware of both of them. Yeah.
So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be? Yeah, okay, so I'm going to have to be strategic about this. I think if I could change one thing, if I had a magic genie or that I could rub, I would make humans disgusted by the taste of meat or animal products. If I could wave a wand, I think I remember there might have been I don't know if it was a mosquito or some sort of bug that was biting people in the American South. You seem familiar with it, that made them like really sick after they ate it. So why would I do this? I mean, I think part of it is I really do think meat eating in particular is something that holds people back from really realizing or maybe even acting consistently on their beliefs about animals. And so the sense that their own self-interest is up against the interests of animals, I think really holds back a lot of people today in today's world from maybe acting in ways and living in ways that part of them finds very compelling. So one of the things I'm optimistic about in the near future is that humans will find ways to make meat out of plants or to grow it in vitro. And I think what is very exciting about this is the idea that people who feel conflicted about eating other animals might no longer see that as against their self-interest. And I think that will really open up I hope, the sort of community who cares about advancing the interests of animals. So if I could wave a wand, that would probably be the thing I would do. Yeah. Fascinating. So Dan, what are you working on next?
So my current research now, I'm finishing up my dissertation, is on the political status of other animals. And so it takes off somewhat from the work of Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka that I mentioned earlier. The basis of what I'm arguing is that we need to think of other animals in explicitly political categories. And I agree with Donaldson and Kimlicka that dividing animals into certain groups, wild animals, domesticated animals, and what they call liminal animals, or maybe urban wildlife, identifies the right groups. What I think, where I disagree with them, an important difference is I think animals present unique challenges to thinking about how they should exist in our political communities, and also what obligations the state has. So what I try to develop is kind of new political categories or political statuses that try to outline and present a framework for thinking about the obligations that the state has towards these different groups of animals and how they should kind of exist in the political world. So that's the broader project that I'm finishing up, and it really is trying to articulate a vision about the political status of other animals.
And so where can people go if they want to learn more about your work?
They can Google me and check out my webpage. I keep that updated with my work, and they can read about it there. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Dan, thank you so much for coming on Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, are you following us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or me personally at SO_S? Have you liked us on Facebook at Knowing Animals? There's also a Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan Facebook page if you're interested. But most importantly, if you haven't already done so, please leave a review at iTunes. Reviews send us much higher up the iTunes rankings and make it easier for people to find the podcast and learn all about animals. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.